The sources you shared wrestle with a massive paradox. How can the fate of the world hang in the balance, resting on the shoulders of these characters we followed for years, yet so many viewers report feeling absolutely no tension?
That's the question, isn't it? It's the paradox that's really driving this whole critical conversation.
We need to figure out why the hype just isn't matching the actual stakes.
Well, the narrative stakes they've escalated to a literal world-ending apocalypse. Vecna's plan is to destroy reality. But for a surprisingly large chunk of the audience, the emotional stakes have just gone completely flat.
And that's where the wild swings in opinion come from.
Exactly. That's why you see the critiques just oscillating violently. 1 minute, it's an epic finale. The next, it's being compared, and not in a good way, to Game of Thrones Season 8.
Okay, so let's unpack this. This is a monumental conflict.
Sure.
Our mission today is a rigorous deep dive into just the immense volume of final act critiques you provided.
We're cutting through the noise here.
We are. We're giving you the shortcut to understanding every single angle of this fan debate. We're going to cover everything from the complex new lore of the Abyss and some really questionable narrative structure.
All the way down to those highly controversial relationship resolutions.
Absolutely.
And if we sort of synthesize the major complaints, they all point to these deep structural anxieties about how the show is going to end. We're really talking about 3 main categories of flaw.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the infamous character bloat and the zero consequences problem that comes from what people are calling infinite plot armor.
Right.
Second, you have the issue of ambiguous relationship conclusions, specifically Nancy and Jonathan.
A huge point of confusion.
A huge one. And third, the show's reliance on having characters suddenly become like theoretical physicists just to explain these overly convoluted plots. It's a symptom of what we're going to call second screenwriting.
It's the ultimate scaling problem. It's too many cooks in the kitchen, but none of them are ever allowed to leave.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So let's start with the most visceral critique in Section 1, the crisis of consequences. Let's look at this plot armor and the diluted stakes.
Okay, so the no deaths critique is pervasive, and it ties directly into this crippling lack of suspense in the late game. It's not just that the main characters survive.
No, it's more than that.
It is. It's that the audience is now emotionally conditioned to expect them to survive, no matter how logically lethal the situation is.
So you're watching, but you're not worried.
You're not. And this expectation, which critics are calling infinite plot armor, it makes these life or death scenarios feel like, elaborate parlor tricks instead of genuine threats.
And we saw this psychological conditioning hit its absolute peak during that near-death escape with Nancy and Jonathan.
Oh, absolutely.
They were trapped in that tunnel. It's actively dissolving around them from this exotic matter goo. We're talking about an imminent, messy, absolute death. They're even resigned to it.
They say their goodbyes.
They do. And yet, the exotic matter just instantly and so conveniently hardens, and they escape without a scratch.
That specific moment was just a lightning rod for criticism. Critics jumped all over it, calling it a blatant deus ex machina, or, more simply, a narrative eraser.
An eraser, I like that.
Because the threat was introduced, it was allowed to reach its maximum intensity, and then it was instantly undone by a totally external, convenient factor, the hardening matter. This completely resets the tension.
And it strengthens that feeling that success or failure, it doesn't matter. It always returns the story right back to the status quo.
Exactly.
And that's the core fear, isn't it? That the finale will just replicate that disappointing lack of consequential deaths and rushed endings we saw in other huge shows. It's why that Game of Thrones Season 8 comparison just keeps popping up.
It does, and it's really important to clarify here. This critique isn't about fans demanding, gratuitous violence or a mass murder.
No, it's about the cost of victory.
The cost of victory. That's it. When the showrunners said before, this isn't Game of Thrones, they were positioning the series as one where character emotion mattered more than the body count.
Which is great at first.
It was. But 5 seasons in, the fact that virtually no foundational character has faced a consequential, permanent fate, it creates the opposite problem. It creates narrative weightlessness. If victory comes without any sacrifice, the victory itself just feels hollow.
Let's dig into some specifics here. The characters who are narratively set up for a heroic sacrifice, only to have that setup just yanked away at the last second. Our primary target is always Steve Harrington.
Steve has been living on borrowed narrative time since season 1. I mean, there's a fascinating piece of trivia that he was originally meant to be killed off very early on.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, which makes every subsequent season we've had with him feel like this unexpected gift. But that historical context means the audience always views him through this lens of potential loss. He's the character who is permanently on the block.
And that tension is just amplified by his relationship with Dustin. Their dynamic is, it's arguably the most beloved in the later seasons.
Oh, for sure.
And it's cemented by that deeply emotional pact, the you die, I die vow. Mm-hmm. Putting that kind of promise on the table felt like really heavy, unmistakable foreshadowing.
It did. The writing generates this immense emotional peril by constantly putting him in lethal situations, the demo bats, the exotic goo tunnels. But if he keeps surviving every single one, the tension from that death setup just dissolves. It turns the peril into a routine.
A routine, yeah. It becomes predictable.
Then you look at Jim Hopper. The way his death was handled in season 3. Joyce turning the keys, Eleven's heart-wrenching reaction, the whole town mourning him.
Yeah.
It was narratively devastating.
It was a perfect ending for him, earned and tragic.
It was. So his sudden resurrection in season 4, having survived the blast and been captured by Russians, it was a massive emotional undoing. It essentially used the audience's grief as a surprise plot twist.
Which diminishes any future threats.
It completely diminishes the impact of any future near-death experiences, even when the setup is as high stakes as the final battle plan near the exotic matter bomb. It tells you, the viewer, if they killed him once and he came back, the threat of death is now officially meaningless.
And we can't forget Lucas Sinclair. His entire emotional journey this season is tied to Max. The sources pointed out this popular theory that he might sacrifice himself to save her.
Right, the parallel to the running up that hill lyric about making a deal with God to switch places.
It was a beautiful idea, narratively.
A beautiful, tragic idea. That he would pay the ultimate cost to keep the person he loves alive. However, the writers kept Max in this state of suspended animation, paralyzed but still alive, which indicates that Lucas's ultimate purpose is tied to her survival and eventual recovery, not his own martyrdom.
And the fan prediction markets, the betting sites, they confirm this kind of cynical truth. The original party members, Mike, Dustin, and Lucas, they're seen as the safest characters in the whole show.
Their survival is basically guaranteed by the brand. The narrative itself protects them.
Which brings us to the stark contrast between this untouchable main cast and what the critics have dubbed the Expendables.
Right. These are the peripheral, though often beloved, characters whose deaths, while emotional, do not devastatingly impact the core plot or, reduce the size of the original friend group.
Think about the pattern.
The pattern is so clear. Bob Newby's death, while absolutely heartbreaking, mainly impacted Joyce's immediate family arc.
It fueled her story, yeah.
Billy's death gave Max a really profound and complex grief arc, and it was arguably necessary for her growth as a character.
And then there's Eddie Munson.
The ultimate fan favorite. His death generated massive emotional weight and guilt for Dustin, but at the end of the day, his removal did not break the foundational structure of the primary cast.
So it confirms this cynical pattern. The show introduces these charismatic, well-developed characters specifically to kill them off.
Exactly. It satisfies the audience's need for dramatic consequence without forcing the writers to make the truly hard choice of removing an original, established character.
The show is unwilling to pay the actual price of the stakes it has created.
And this unwillingness to cull the herd brings us right to the next structural issue of scale: character bloat and screen time allocation. Many critics argue the cast size is now over 50 named recurring characters.
50 plus. That's not a cast, that's a small army. And that kind of character density creates an impossible structural problem. You're forced to either give 90% of them pointless subplots, or, even worse, reduce established characters to
static mannequins.
Exactly. Just standing around.
They end up just standing around waiting for the high-stakes dialogue to end instead of organically moving the plot forward or having those genuine, quirky side conversations that made the show feel so real in the early seasons.
The narrative has to prioritize escalating the plot over just letting these people breathe and interact like real people.
And we see this structural problem most dramatically in what we're calling the Holly Wheeler phenomenon.
This was the source of so much fan frustration and confusion.
Complete confusion. Why did the final act dedicate so much screen time to Holly Wheeler? A character who, before this, mostly served as minor set dressing, sitting in a high chair. Nell Fisher's performance was universally praised, but the sudden narrative focus was just baffling.
And the speculation went wild. The sources point to two main theories for this sudden focus. One is purely logistical.
Which is?
She's being built up as a potential lead for a future spin-off. It's a way to reintroduce that core dynamic of younger kids solving a mystery. Essentially, they're passing the torch to a new, younger generation.
Okay, that makes some business sense. But the more critical analysis suggests her arc was a massive concession to the show don't tell conflict.
Right. Her extended journey in Vecna's mind, where she briefly becomes Holly the Heroic, was used almost entirely as an exposition dump.
A way to reveal crucial new lore points that the writers needed the audience to grasp immediately without having the main characters work for it.
So let's elaborate on what we actually learned through Holly. It was through her perspective, or what Vecna shows her, that we get these huge informational dumps. First, the confirmation that Max is not brain dead.
Right, that she's fully aware inside Vecna's mind and she's suffering a huge piece of information.
Second, the discovery that Henry is in fact lying to the captured children about their purpose.
Third, and this is maybe the most crucial point for the overall plot, we learn that Henry Vecna is afraid of something deeper in the abyss, a terror that actually grounds his own actions.
And fourth, the visual of the abyss being vertical. It's a deep, endless pit, and that explains why Eleven couldn't find Henry and the kids earlier with her powers.
Because they weren't on a horizontal plane, they were buried vertically at an impossible depth.
These are four massive narrative-shaping pieces of information. And critics are arguing that these lore points should have been conveyed organically, through the main character's detective work or through more established psychic connections.
Not just shoehorned into a new character's brief, repetitive arc.
Exactly. And the execution failed because of the repetitive, what the sources call cyclical plotting, are her arc. She is constantly almost escaping.
She sees the portal, the key to freedom,
only to be immediately recaptured and sucked back up, which returns the story right back to square one.
The first time that happens, it's tense. The second time, it feels like a forced delay.
And the third time, it just strengthens the idea that these character-focused events are ultimately arbitrary because they lead to absolutely no consequences. It's the same thing as Max's failed escape attempt before. The narrative weight is zero.
It's this constant reset button, and it's frustrating. If the writers feel the need to give every single character an intense moment, but then refuse to let that moment have any lasting impact or consequence, the audience just disengages.
So we've established the narrative structure is buckling under the weight of this massive, untouchable cast.
And part of that structural failure comes directly from the mythology just getting more and more complex.
Which is a perfect transition to Section 2, because the show isn't just about the Upside Down anymore. It's about decoding the mythology. Vecna, the Abyss, and all the retcons needed to make this massive final act work.
The lore has definitely undergone a tremendous expansion. We've moved far beyond the simple parallel dimension concept of Season 1. We are now deep in expanding multiverse territory with concepts like Dimension X or the Abyss and the introduction of exotic matter.
The Upside Down isn't a destination anymore, it's just a bridge.
It's a bridge, and this expansion is anchored in a really surprising place. The prequel material, specifically the first Shadow Play.
Right. We're talking about Project Rainbow, which was a classified U.S. military experiment from the 1940s. Let's simplify this complicated piece of history for the listener.
Okay, so Project Rainbow was a high-level military attempt to use powerful electromagnetic energy generated by these massive coils and emitters to essentially cloak or teleport military assets. In 1943, during a live experiment, they briefly, and we're talking fractions of a second, transported a ship out of our reality and into Dimension X.
The ship returned, damaged.
Right, but critically, only Dr. Brenner's father survived.
And that single event, the survival of Brenner Sr., is the seed of the entire story.
It is. It traumatized the father, and it utterly consumed the son, Dr. Brenner. He dedicated his entire life and the entire existence of Hawkins' lab to researching this dimensional bridge, trying to harness the power that briefly touched Dimension X.
So this retcons the very nature of the Upside Down. It's no longer just a dark mirror of Hawkins.
Not at all. Now it's characterized as this mutable wormhole or an unstable bridge between the real world and the true source of evil, which is the Abyss, or Dimension X.
And this shift immediately triggers what the sources call the inconsistency critique. For years, the Upside Down was described as a toxic, radioactive, and biologically dangerous atmosphere. You remember the spores, the toxic air.
Immediate danger of just being down there for too long.
Exactly. But now, characters are able to just casually hang out in the Upside Down. We see new main characters, like Mike, who's exploring the legitimate Upside Down for the first time.
And he's not only surviving prolonged exposure, but doing so with no apparent long-term consequences from the toxic air. Critics argue that this internal consistency is being completely ignored for the sake of plot convenience.
So you can have groups operate wherever the plot needs them to be.
Precisely.
And that plot convenience extended directly into the final plan with the exotic matter. The whole plan relies on detonating a powerful bomb near this concentrated exotic matter to collapse the bridge between Earth and the abyss.
Right, and this exotic matter is presented as highly unstable and dangerous. It's what caused the tunnel walls to melt and nearly killed Nancy and Jonathan. It's presented as semi-sentient and highly mutable.
And that's where the narrative eraser comes out again.
It does. Nancy shoots the exotic matter, causing the walls around them to dissolve and melt, trapping them in this fatal goo. They are literally having their farewell, believing they're about to be dissolved.
But then suddenly the exotic matter instantly hardens into a rock-like substance, and they're saved.
It is the definition of a deus ex machina. The material behaves exactly how the plot needs it to, regardless of its established danger. It removes the threat precisely at the moment the emotional stakes were at their absolute maximum.
The threat just vanishes instantly. It subverts any earned consequence.
And what made this specific scene feel particularly cynical was the visual contrast with the dead soldiers who were also trapped in the melting goo nearby.
Well, that's a great point.
Because those soldiers were shown decomposed or partially dissolved by the exotic matter. So if the matter hardened so quickly, why weren't they saved? It makes the distinction between the main cast, who are immune to consequences, and everyone else who are simply expendable, painfully obvious, visually insulting even.
Okay, let's pivot to the villain and the hidden mastermind. This new lore framework radically changes how we view the show's main threat. Let's turn now to Henry Creel, and whether he's a man or just a mouthpiece.
The mythology has spent a lot of time humanizing Henry Creel, especially through the first Shadow play, which paints him as this complex, tragic protagonist. We see his early life, his interactions with a younger Joyce, a younger Hopper, even Bob Newby.
And crucially, the play shows him bonding with a character named Patty before the Creel murders.
Yes. This humanization is designed to elicit sympathy, but it also creates a lot of narrative confusion. In the play, when he uses his powers, vines wrap around him, and his sister Alice realizes, that's not Henry, you're not him.
That subtle distinction feeds directly into this debate about who is ultimately in control.
And we have two major theories circulating in the sources. Theory 1 argues that Henry Vecna is an unreliable narrator because his memories are shattered.
How so?
The play explicitly shows his mother and sister's deaths differently than the account he gave to Nancy in season 4. This suggests Henry is either selectively editing his own trauma to justify his actions,
or his perception is just inherently skewed because of his connection to the abyss.
Exactly. Then you have theory 2, which is far more dramatic, the Mind Flayer control theory. This argues that the Mind Flayer, the massive godlike entity that used to rule the Upside Down, actually possessed Henry when Eleven banished him.
So the Mind Flayer is the true mastermind, and it's just using Henry Vecna as a mouthpiece.
That's the theory, and the evidence for it is pretty strong. Remember the moment when Vecna's voice distorted and he said, referring to Patty, she's ours? That shift in pronoun from mine to ours suggests a plural consciousness,
implying that the Mind Flayer is the dominant entity and has been pulling the strings all along.
Using Henry's immense psychic power and his human motivation to enact its own dimensional takeover.
But regardless of whether Henry is a traumatized human or a possessed mouthpiece, there's this pervasive Vecna's incompetence critique. Fans are just frustrated by his bizarre and frankly inconsistent decision-making this season.
He seems to be intentionally delaying his own success.
It starts with a glaringly obvious point. Why did Vecna need Will to locate Max?
Right. Max, who was already targeted and nearly killed, was logically in the only hospital in the entire county, recovering from catastrophic trauma. Vecna is established as this genius strategist who can see deep into minds across dimensions.
Yet he needs a teenage boy to figure out the most logical, common-sense location. It feels like the writers just needed a reason for Will to be centrally involved in the final act, so they invented this plot point, rather than having Vecna act with consistent intelligence.
And this inconsistency is compounded by his victimology. If Vecna can capture 12 children this season for his massive ritual, which is a huge, efficient operation, why did he go through the complicated, time-consuming, and highly individualized process of finding 4 specific victims back in season 4?
Critics are also questioning why he focuses his energy almost entirely on terrorizing the core group of teenagers, despite showing he has the power to easily destroy trained military personnel and equipment whenever he wants.
His ability to kill seems highly inconsistent. It favors plot convenience, making the teenagers the center of the action over consistent power scaling. It's a structural necessity, forcing the villain to wait for the heroes to catch up.
So it creates this feeling that Vecna is intentionally stalling for plot reasons.
Yeah.
He needs Will to confess his fears. He needs the main cast to have time to prepare. He needs the final ritual delayed until the last possible minute.
It results in a villain who seems determined to postpone his own inevitable world conquest.
Okay, let's move to section 3. Relationship controversies and character depth. Because the stakes were just as high for the characters' personal lives and the results were intensely divisive, we have to discuss the Will Byers moment.
Absolutely. The highly controversial 6-minute coming out scene, which, by the way, required an intense 12 hours of filming. It's been slammed for both its narrative timing and its execution.
Let's first look at the stated narrative rationale, because it was crucial. The writer said Will needed to dispel his deepest fear, the fear of non-acceptance, of being alienated, so that Vecna couldn't use it as a trump card against him in the final psychic battle.
So it was designed as an emotional power-up. It allows him to enter the fight immune to Vecna's psychological attacks.
And that's a valid strategic reason. But critics felt the execution failure was monumental.
It was. The scene was delivered as this overly long, highly dramatic monologue that just completely interrupted the urgent, high-octane flow of the world-ending plot. The emotional shift felt so artificially shoehorned in.
People immediately compared it, and not favorably, to Robin's coming out scene.
Which was handled with such subtlety. It was an intimate dialogue in a closet setting. It felt organic and true to the characters and their relationship.
Will's scene, by contrast, felt like a staged press conference. He's making this spectacular, highly emotional reveal to a diverse group of people, many of whom, like Nancy and Jonathan, he barely even knows anymore.
And adding to the controversy was the group's reaction. This immediate, blanket, wholesale acceptance, we're not leaving. This doesn't change anything.
Critics argued this felt narratively unrealistic for a small, sheltered town in the 1980s, a time when the AIDS epidemic had created rampant homophobia and fear.
Right. So the argument was that the show was sacrificing period authenticity for modern emotional convenience. And that led to some accusations from more right-leaning critics of the show pushing a woke agenda.
And this whole controversy is just inextricably linked to the huge fan movement known as the Bylership fandom. We need to dedicate some time to unpacking the nuance here, because this wasn't just arbitrary shipping.
Not at all. A significant portion of the audience and critics argue, the writing itself, spent years building up all this subtextual evidence suggesting a potential Mike-Will romance.
It was fueled by Will's deep emotional reliance on Mike, his inability to move on from their childhood dynamic, and some very key visual cues.
Think about the specifics. The emotional weight around Will's painting in season 4, which seemed to symbolize Mike's emotional unavailability to him. The sources note the years of specific looks, glances, and emotional talks Mike shared with others, like Eleven, even Dustin, but he always avoided having with Will.
Creating this vacuum that the fandom filled with romantic tension.
Exactly. So the feeling among Byler fans was that the confirmation of Yu's sexuality should have culminated in some kind of romantic validation from Mike, providing the true emotional strength Will needed.
And when the show confirmed Will was gay, but not that the relationship was reciprocated, it led to massive disappointment.
That disappointment is what fueled that viral petition, signed by over 300,000 people, demanding the release of deleted footage.
This wasn't just about fan service. It was a genuine belief that the writers had caved to external pressure and removed an intended canonical Mike-Will romance.
It really reveals a deeper anxiety that the show failed to satisfy years of carefully cultivated subtextual buildup. For some, confirming Will's sexuality without confirming the romance felt like a narrative erasure or a coping mechanism, an attempt to satisfy representation needs without challenging the established heterosexual pairing of Mike and Eleven.
Okay, next, let's look at Mike, Elle, Nancy, and Jonathan. The forgotten dynamics. Starting with the core couple, Mike and Eleven's relationship just feels flat. It feels like it's relying heavily on past chemistry rather than any active present-day development.
The critique is brutal. Mike has been criticized for lacking any real arc this season, leading to the dreaded cardboard cutout syndrome. I mean, you could genuinely pull Mike out of the final act and the plot still fundamentally works.
He's reduced to a glorified boyfriend just waiting on the sidelines for the hug scene.
His role is so diminished that critics suggest his sole purpose is just to serve as Eleven's emotional anchor, rather than being an active participant in solving the crisis or undergoing any personal growth. It's symptomatic of the overall focus shifting decisively away from intricate character dynamics and towards massive action and spectacle.
And then we have the perplexing Nancy-Jonathan unproposal breakup.
Yeah.
This scene, which happened while they were literally trapped in the melting exotic matter tunnel, it just proved to be confusing writing because it was so ambiguous.
It was supposed to be this pivotal discussion about their diverging futures. Nancy focused on Hawkins, Jonathan focused on safety and family. Yet, up to 30% of viewers walked away thinking they had confirmed their profound love and decided not to marry to reduce pressure, thereby strengthening their connection.
They interpreted it as a renewal of vows, not a quiet dissolution of the relationship.
And that ambiguity was a profound failure of execution. The language they used, it was all about commitment and future plans. It felt too close to an affirmation of their bond. The fact that the scene's intention was so unclear to such a large segment of the audience contributes directly to this feeling of bad writing.
Or just a complete lack of clarity and consequence in major emotional beats. If you have to go read interviews with the writers to figure out if two characters broke up, the writing has failed.
Absolutely. And this feeds into the overall issue of missing bonds throughout the final act. Many core relationships are only stated or implied, not actively shown. This leads to emotional beats that feel unearned, especially for new or casual viewers.
Take Will and Eleven. They lived together for a year, they moved across the country, supposedly becoming like brother and sister, yet they share so few meaningful on-screen interactions to build that current bond.
The narrative just expects you to remember that connection was established off-screen or in previous seasons.
Similarly, Nancy and her little sister Holly, they rarely interacted meaningfully through the whole run of the show. So when Nancy is suddenly thrown into a panic over her sister's abduction, the emotional beat feels less impactful because the closeness between them hasn't been actively demonstrated.
You're told they are close, but you aren't shown the small, loving interactions that make you invest in their survival.
It's the difference between being told characters are family versus genuinely seeing their closeness develop through dialogue and shared experience.
And when the narrative focuses solely on spectacle, those quiet relationship-building moments are the first things to be sacrificed. It leaves the audience intellectually informed, but emotionally detached.
That structural sacrifice takes us squarely into Section 4, the metacritique, focusing on the writing and structural flaws that underpin all of these other issues. If the show feels discombobulated, the narrative structure is probably the root cause.
Many critics are using a key analogy here. They argue that the final season feels less like a smoothly woven narrative tapestry and more like a collection of thrilling moments.
So the episodes are engineered for viral social media clips. The peak of the action, the big emotional monologue, but the overall flow just lacks cohesion.
And this manifests as stop-start storytelling. You get these long, exhilarating stretches of high-stakes plot, chase sequences, or military action, and then the whole thing just slams on the brakes for lengthy character monologues or drawn-out emotional heart-to-hearts.
The 6-minute Will's coming out scene is the prime example. It was critically important, but its placement felt so arbitrarily shoehorned into a moment of crisis.
The Nancy-Jonathan discussion happening while they were literally melting is another one. These character beats don't arise organically from the flow of action. They interrupt it. They sacrifice pacing for exposition.
And this leads directly to the most cynical theory from the sources, second screenwriting. This is the idea that the entire narrative pacing and dialogue structure is designed around how people watch TV in the streaming age.
Let's simplify this. The theory suggests this, that writers and studios, driven by network data, are terrified of losing the mobile viewer, the person scrolling on their phone while the show is running. They know they can't rely on subtlety or complex visual storytelling.
So plots have to be intentionally simplified or over-explained in exposition-heavy dialogue. That way, a viewer who only glances at the screen every few minutes can still grasp the immediate threat, the plan, and the stakes.
And subtlety is sacrificed entirely for absolute clarity. And this is how the characters become theoretical physicists. Because the writers can't rely on visual context or character history, they have to resort to constant heavy exposition. They have characters explaining convoluted plans, using simplified analogies. It's like a wormhole, or sudden on-the-spot ingenuity just to make sure the information is clearly delivered.
Often sacrificing the character's natural voice and expertise in the process.
Right. And this need to over-explain also ties back to the issue of character bloat and the need for everyone to have an aha moment to justify their presence.
It's the constant leveling up of every character's intelligence and utility. Why else would Mike Wheeler suddenly become the person who crafts the complicated exotic matter bomb in the finale planning session?
It makes no sense. Mike's established skill set has always been emotional. He's the heart of the group. But because the plot requires a bomb and Mike needs a role, he suddenly becomes the bomb expert.
It really speaks to a deep structural flaw when the writing sacrifices character authenticity just to give everyone something functional to do in a constantly escalating plot that demands complex on-the-fly solutions.
It removes their distinct strengths and reduces them all to generic action heroes.
So finally, let's summarize the ultimate outcome of all these structural issues: the missing emotional impact. We just keep coming back to this mantra: zero consequences.
We've tracked narrative failures like Will being captured and possibly tortured by Vecna, and narrative successes like Holly's initial brief escape, and both ultimately result in a full status quo reset.
Will is instantly saved by Eleven. Holly is instantly recaptured. The characters return to their starting position immediately after surviving their ordeal.
Which leaves you, the viewer, emotionally drained and numb because you realize the emotional journey you just took was effectively erased.
The core fan feeling is that the show has just lost its original focus. It began as this highly grounded, character-driven, small-town mystery sci-fi horror thing built on the emotional realism of 1980s adolescence.
And now that focus has been entirely replaced by prioritizing massive, Marvel-esque action, gargantuan spectacle, and convoluted lore involving Dimension X and the Abyss. The older characters feel more like professional colleagues managing a crisis than close friends.
And consequently, moments of genuine emotional complexity feel unearned or diluted because they're only stated in dialogue rather than shown through organic interaction.
So, to recap this meticulously detailed deep dive, the final act is battling these existential, world-ending threats, but it's struggling intensely to make those threats feel meaningful. And that's due to the perceived plot armor around the core cast, the structural issues of a bloated ensemble and stop-start pacing, and the failure to resolve key relationship dynamics with any clarity.
But the intensity of fan passion remains undeniable. I mean, it's evidenced by the sheer volume of critiques you sent us and that massive petition signed by over 300,000 people desperately hoping for a preferred narrative outcome, particularly around the Byler theory. The audience cares so deeply, but they feel the execution is betraying their investment.
It's clear that the finale carries an immense weight of expectation. But let's leave you with this provocative thought. If the showrunners are consciously subverting expectations by refusing to kill main characters, making the decision not to take risks a deliberate narrative choice, does that shift the narrative tension entirely?
Yep.
Does the focus move completely from who survives to how do they win, making the ending less about tragic loss and more about the collective bulletproof power of friendship, for better or worse? If the only thing that matters is the collective power of these kids, does their individual survival then become the entire point?
That's a massive question for the listener to mull over. Thank you for sharing such rich and complex sources with us.
And that's all the time we have for this deep dive.
Today we're digging into, well, what might be the biggest problem facing any huge ensemble finale. How do you balance preserving the characters we all love against delivering consequences that actually feel real and, earned?
It really is the ultimate tightrope walk, isn't it? Especially for a series that's so deeply invested in nostalgia and childhood and these friendships that we followed for years. I think the central question we're facing is, should a show like this have to introduce genuine, tragic, permanent consequences? I'm talking major character deaths to maintain narrative integrity, or is just prioritizing the core cast's emotional payoffs enough for a satisfying ending?
And I'll be arguing that, yeah, it does. The series has, I think, fundamentally failed to deliver necessary stakes by continually refusing to eliminate main characters. This narrative caution has resulted in what a lot of critics are calling plot armor, and it makes the final conflict feel a lot less impactful than it should.
And I'm coming at this from a completely different angle. I believe that insisting on gratuitous death just for shock value fundamentally misunderstands the show's core identity. This is an adventure story. It's focused on the survival and the resolution of these deep, established relationships, not some political horror fantasy. Killing central figures just to satisfy some perceived genre rule would, I think, actively undermine everything that made the series work in the first place.
That might be the intention, but the execution, I think, tells a different story. The feeling right now is that the tension is just gone because the audience knows the core ensemble, especially the original four boys, they're always going to be safe. We are dealing with literal world-ending threats here. The Upside Down is collapsing into Hawkins, and yet there's this deep-seated expectation that these kids are basically bulletproof. This refusal to introduce real finality means the finale now requires bold, tragic choices just to provide that earned and satisfying ending. And honestly, they waited too long.
I'm sorry. I just don't buy that the show is somehow obligated to pivot into a grim tragedy just because the stakes are high. The creative team has been very consistent about this. They frame this not as Game of Thrones, but as those, old school adventure stories like The Goonies or Stand By Me. The horror is there, sure, but the stakes exist in the journey, in their trauma, and in the danger of the confrontation itself, not in arbitrary shock deaths. Killing someone like Eleven, who is the absolute emotional and narrative center of the show, it would fundamentally change the series into something unrecognizable. The emotional weight, in my view, has already been paid. It's just not been paid by the characters you're demanding. We saw the devastating grief Dustin experienced after Eddie's death, and before that, Bob Newby's sacrificial ending.
But that is precisely the problem. Bob and Eddie's deaths they're structural sacrifices. They only work to protect the core group, which just confirms the audience's expectation that Mike, Lucas, and Dustin are untouchable. And if we look at that core ensemble, their survival feels less like a heroic triumph and more like, a consequence-free inevitability. And that leads directly to my first big contention. This pervasive illusion of danger is actively destroying the show's narrative credibility.
Okay, that's a strong claim. How does the illusion of danger actively destroy credibility rather than just, say, reducing the number of permanent losses?
Because by consistently subverting the consequences, this show creates a situation where nothing the characters do feels truly effective. The safety net is always visible. Think back to that sequence where Nancy and Jonathan are trapped. Dustin is screaming, panicking about the exotic matter from the Upside Down melting around them, warning them not to touch it. This is set up as this moment of extreme, irreversible biological peril. And then, suddenly, the stuff just stops melting. It hardens and they escape without a scratch.
Okay, I will grant you that one. That sequence with the exotic matter hardening was probably the weakest moment of peril in recent memory. It certainly felt manufactured. It was a structural convenience just to get the characters out of a corner they'd been written into.
It's more than just weak. It breaks the internal rules they've established. It's a narrative deus ex machina delivered by the environment itself. And this pattern creates a boy who cried wolf feeling. We've seen these repeated fake-outs. Hopper in season 3, the constant threat to Max that culminates in her paralysis, only for her to then regain her sight in the final moments.
Right. But I think framing Max's situation as a complete fake-out really minimizes the cost. Max is now permanently disabled. She was in a coma, she's grappling with blindness and paralysis. Her physical state is a colossal, permanent consequence that grounds the threat of Vecna. Her trauma is very real, and Lucas's entire arc is now defined by his care for her. Their survival is absolutely not consequence-free.
That's an interesting point, but I'd argue even with Max, the narrative hedge is still there. The fact that she regained her sight, even partially, is that little escape clause that signals to the audience, see, no one important is truly going to be broken beyond repair. And if you look at the villains, the problem is even clearer. They spared Dr. K twice, despite her actively villainous role in Project Indigo. She was directly responsible for some of the show's darkest events.
But Dr. K's survival serves a structural purpose, I think, beyond just prolonging the conflict. By keeping her alive, the show is allowing for a more complex, thematic resolution about the institutions that enabled all this, not just the monsters themselves. I mean, if every morally compromised character is immediately eliminated, the ethical complexity of the government's role in creating this crisis just evaporates. All you're left with is a physical fight against Vecna.
But if she's going to be spared, she needs agency, not just survival. Her escape attempts felt purely procedural. And look at the difference. They kill off faceless soldiers, the impact is generic, but they spare a named, impactful antagonist just to keep a little subplot simmering. It cheapens the immense danger that Vecna and the entire upside-down invasion pose. If the threat is truly existential, there have to be existential costs.
I disagree that it cheapens the threat. The threat is still immense, but the show is choosing to illustrate the cost through emotional and psychological damage, which is pretty consistent with its 80s horror inspiration. And furthermore, the show has used secondary characters not as padding, but for vital structural purposes. You criticize the focus on Holly Wheeler.
I did. I cited her apparent increase in screen time, which felt like narrative padding or maybe setting up a spinoff.
But her screen time was used to show, don't tell key pieces of lore that were crucial to the climax. It was through Holly that we found out that Max was still aware inside Vecna's mind and that the abyss is vertical in relation to the upside down. Those moments, conveyed through a character whose survival is necessary for other reasons, like Mike's continued grounding, still serve a vital thematic purpose. That level of detail is just necessary in an ensemble of this size.
Okay, but if we're talking about necessary depths and structural costs, that brings us right to my second contention, the diminishing efficacy of sacrificing new characters instead of core ones. This formula of introducing characters like Derek or fan favorites like Eddie, only to kill them off, it's becoming painfully predictable. It fails to raise the stakes for the main ensemble, who just remain perpetually bulletproof.
I think that criticism is applying a different genre's expectation to this show. The true focus of this final story is the emotional resolution for the characters we followed for years. Killing Mike, as the creators themselves pointed out, would make the show not Stranger Things anymore. The identity of the series is tied to this specific group growing up together. The emotional payoff rests on seeing relationships like that pure friendship between Steve and Dustin reach their necessary conclusion, whether that's going to college or something else.
But that preservation of character integrity risks sacrificing narrative integrity. When the final villain is defeated and every major player is still standing, the victory feels unearned because a real price wasn't paid. I think the audience's attachment to the original cast is slowly being eroded by this safety and sprawl. People want proper character send-offs, not narrative padding that just delays the conflict resolution, or worse, a finale where everyone simply graduates and moves on.
I think you misunderstand the nature of the payoff the show is aiming for. The characters who have suffered the most deserve resolution, not arbitrary death. I mean, consider Joyce Byers. She has fought for her family since the very first episode. She finally found happiness and stability with Hopper. After everything they've been through, undercutting that resolution just for shock value feels like, well, it feels like unearned cruelty. And it fundamentally undermines the show's belief in human perseverance, in the value of fighting for a normal life.
But human perseverance requires loss to be meaningful. If Joyce and Hopper get their perfect ending, and Mike, Lucas, Dustin, and Eleven all walk away with just emotional scars, the lesson is that confronting existential horror has no real physical cost if you're a main character. It suggests that their trauma can be packaged neatly into a sequel or spin-off, which a lot of fans already fear is happening.
But the show is prioritizing the testing and resolution of those established relationships, even if they don't end in death. Look at the complex breakup scene between Jonathan and Nancy.
Which felt unnecessarily ambiguous, if I'm being honest.
Perhaps, but the intent was clearly to show a mature, loving decision made in the middle of a crisis. They were testing the limits of their relationship under extreme duress. That kind of relational consequence, choosing distance to protect each other, is a valid form of high stakes, even if it's not fatal.
The argument that every narrative problem must be solved with a main character's body count is just reductionist. The stakes are in the final battle plan, 11 entering Vecna's mind, the bomb near the exotic matter. The stakes are immense. But the resolution is tied to the survival of the people we've been with since season 1, and that is a legitimate creative choice.
I'm just not convinced. The focus on surviving relationships makes the final threat feel like a backdrop to personal drama rather than the driving force. You said that killing Mike would make this show not Stranger Things anymore, but I'd argue the unwillingness to embrace severe consequence has already made it feel less like a true high-stakes drama and more like a carefully managed adventure property. The biggest risk isn't killing a character, it's delivering an ending that's actually conclusive.
The series is still capable of truly moving moments, though, and those moments get their power from the history between these characters, and the audience is intensely invested in these resolutions. I mean, you see the sheer volume of engagement, the fan petition demanding deleted footage related to certain romantic pairings. That demonstrates how deeply invested people are in seeing these character threads closed off in a meaningful way, whether that ending is tragic or victorious.
And that is precisely where we fundamentally disagree. I think the core tension here rests on whether narrative fidelity demands death as a price for world-saving stakes to make the victory feel real, or whether the emotional value justifies the continuation of plot armor. I maintain that without severe, permanent loss, a true death among the ensemble, the final season's events risk feeling empty and safe, leaving the audience ultimately dissatisfied, wishing the creative team had taken the risk needed for an impactful finale.
And I believe the true measure of the finale won't be the body count, but the quality of the resolution of these relationships. If the characters survive, having faced their greatest fears and endured horrific loss among their community, like Eddie and Bob, it affirms the power of their bond. The victory will be earned through perseverance and love, not through shock and cynicism. We apply different metrics to what an earned ending means in this specific context.
An excellent point, and the audience clearly has a large stake in which metric prevails.
Indeed. There is certainly more to explore in the material when we consider the cost of survival.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.